Captain Sarah Reaper Chun had earned her call sign the hard way, though not for the reasons most people assumed. While other pilots collected enemy kills like trophies, Sarah collected something far more valuable in the unforgiving theater of Operation Iraqi Freedom. She collected lives. American lives. Lives that would have been lost forever if not for her willingness to push her 10 Thunderbolt II into situations that defied both physics and common sense. The morning of March 15th, 2005, dawned like any other at Forward Operating Base Spiker, with the familiar symphony of jet engines screaming to life and the acrid smell of JP-8 fuel hanging heavy in the desert air. Sarah stood beside her aircraft, tail number 78-0691, running her pre-flight inspection with a methodical precision that had kept her alive through 47 combat missions. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, watched her with the kind of protective reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Rodriguez had been turning wrenches on military aircraft for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like what Sarah could do with an A-10. The woman had a supernatural ability to coax performance from the twin-engine beast that shouldn't have been possible according to any flight manual ever written. "She's purring like a kitten today, Captain," Rodriguez said, patting the titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit. "Fresh hydraulics, new tires, and I personally blessed every bolt on her." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her usually serious features. At 28, she was young for a flight leader, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much death and refused to let it break her spirit. "You always take good care of us, Rodriguez. That's why we keep coming home." The comment was casual, thrown off like a joke, but Rodriguez felt the gravity behind it. In the 6 months since Sarah had arrived at Spiker, her squadron's casualty rate had dropped to virtually zero. Not because she avoided dangerous missions. Quite the opposite. Sarah volunteered for every close air support mission that came across the wire, especially the ones that made other pilots suddenly develop mysterious maintenance issues with their aircraft. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as pilots gathered around the intelligence officer, Major Patricia Wells. The mission board showed 3 separate tasking orders, all marked with a red stripe that indicated troops in contact, American forces under active enemy fire, and in immediate need of air support. "Gentlemen and ladies," Wells began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had delivered too many of these briefings, "we have multiple incidents developing simultaneously across our area of operations. First, we have a Marine patrol that's pinned down in Ramadi. Second, an Army convoy has hit an IED and is taking heavy fire near Fallujah. Third, and most critical, we have a downed helicopter crew approximately 30 kilometers north of here in what intelligence describes as a target-rich environment." The room fell silent. Every pilot knew what target-rich environment meant in military speak. Enemy fighters crawling over the landscape like ants on spilled honey. Captain Jake Viper Morrison, one of the F-16 pilots, leaned forward in his chair. At 32, Morrison was considered one of the best stick and rudder men in the Air Force, with a confirmed kill count that made him something of a celebrity back at the Pentagon. His Falcon could reach Mach 2 and carried enough ordnance to level city blocks, but even he looked uncomfortable with the day's tasking. "Ma'am," Morrison said, raising his hand, "what's the estimated enemy strength at the helicopter crash site?" Wells consulted her notes, and Sarah could see the woman's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Intelligence suggests between 40 and 60 hostile fighters, with at least 2 technical vehicles mounting heavy machine guns. The down crew is alive but surrounded, and they're running low on ammunition." A collective intake of breath filled the room. 60 fighters with crew-served weapons represented a nightmare scenario for any rescue operation. F-16s could deliver precision strikes, but they flew too fast and too high to provide the kind of persistent close air support that a surrounded ground team needed. They would make one pass, drop their bombs, and be gone, leaving the rescue team to fend for themselves until the next aircraft could arrive on station. Sarah raised her hand without hesitation. "I'll take the helicopter crew." Morrison turned to stare at her, his expression mixing respect with something that might have been concern. "Reaper, that's a lot of bad guys for one Warthog." Maybe we should— The A-10 was built for this, Sarah interrupted, her voice calm, but carrying absolute conviction. Fast movers are great for buildings and bunkers, but when Americans are bleeding on the ground, they need something that can stay and fight. Colonel James Hammer Davidson, the squadron commander, studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of a man who had been making life and death decisions since before she was born. Davidson was old-school Air Force, a veteran of Desert Storm who understood both the capabilities and limitations of every aircraft under his command. "Chun," he said finally, "you'll have F-16 top cover, but they'll be operating at altitude to avoid the ground fire. Once you go low, you're on your own until you can climb back up to a safe altitude." Sarah nodded, already running mission parameters through her head. The A-10's titanium armor could withstand most small arms fire, and her 30mm GU-8 cannon could chew through anything the enemy might throw at her. But 60 fighters with heavy weapons represented a significant threat, especially if they had shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. "Understood, sir. What's the timeline?" "The helicopter went down 43 minutes ago," Wells replied, checking her watch. "The crew activated their emergency beacon, but we lost contact with them 6 minutes ago. They could be captured, wounded, or worse." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Every pilot in the room understood the implications. In Iraq, being captured often meant torture, execution, or both, frequently broadcast on the internet as propaganda. "Reaper, wait up." He jogged to catch up with her in the hallway, his expression serious. "Look, I know you've got a reputation for pulling off miracles, but this one feels different. 60 fighters isn't a skirmish, it's a small army." Sarah paused, studying Morrison's face. Despite the competitive rivalry that naturally existed between fighter pilots and attack pilots, she had genuine respect for the F-16 driver. Morrison had saved her life twice during previous missions, providing top cover while she extracted wounded soldiers from impossible situations. "I appreciate the concern, Viper, but those are Americans down there. Maybe they're Marines, maybe they're Army, maybe they're Air Force, doesn't matter. They're ours, and they're counting on us to bring them home." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding the weight of responsibility that drove Sarah's decision. "All right, but I'll be up there watching your 6, and if things go sideways, you climb to Angel's 20, and we'll figure out another approach." "Deal," Sarah agreed, though they both knew that once she committed to the rescue, climbing to safety might not be an option. The walk to her aircraft felt longer than usual, each step carrying the weight of what lay ahead. Rodriguez was waiting beside the A-10, having completed his final inspection. The aircraft looked like what it was, a flying tank designed to deliver devastating firepower while absorbing incredible amounts of punishment. Its twin engines, mounted high on the fuselage, could keep flying even after taking multiple hits, and the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit could stop anything short of a direct hit from heavy artillery. "She's ready, Captain," Rodriguez said, handing Sarah her helmet. "All systems green, full fuel, and enough 30mm ammunition to fight a small war." Sarah accepted the helmet, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. "Rodriguez, if something happens to me today, nothing's going to happen," the crew chief interrupted firmly. "You're coming back. You always come back." The confidence in his voice was absolute, born from months of watching Sarah accomplish the impossible. But as she climbed into the cockpit and began her startup procedures, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that today might be different. The numbers were too stark, the odds too long, even for someone with her track record. As the twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, Sarah ran through her mental checklist one final time. She had 1,174 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition, enough for approximately 18 seconds of sustained fire. She carried a mixed load of AGM-65 Maverick missiles, Mark 82 bombs, and illumination flares. More importantly, she had the absolute conviction that no American serviceman would die on her watch if she had anything to say about it. The radio crackled to life as she taxied toward the runway. "Reaper 1-1, this is Tower. You're cleared for immediate departure. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Bring them home." "Roger, Tower." Reaper 1-1 is rolling. As her A-10 lifted off into the burning blue sky, Sarah could see Morrison's F-16 already climbing to altitude, ready to provide overwatch for what might be the most dangerous mission of her career. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, hiding somewhere in its vastness 4 American aircrews whose lives depended on her ability to do something that had never been attempted before: single-handedly assault a fortified enemy position and extract friendly forces under overwhelming odds. Behind her, the base grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the endless expanse of sand and stone that had swallowed so many good people. Ahead lay 30 kilometers of hostile territory and an enemy that had been planning this ambush since the moment the helicopter hit the ground. But Sarah Chun hadn't earned the call sign Reaper by avoiding impossible missions. She had earned it by making the impossible look routine, one rescue at a time. Today would be no different, regardless of what the odds suggested. The radio frequency designated for combat search and rescue remained ominously silent as she flew north, carrying with her the hopes of everyone who had ever been saved by an A-10's distinctive sound. The deep, thunderous roar that meant help had arrived and Americans were going home. The coordinates led Sarah into a landscape that looked like the surface of Mars had been carpet-bombed by angry gods. 28 minutes after takeoff, she found herself flying over a maze of wadis, dry riverbeds that carved the desert into a series of natural trenches and hiding places perfect for an ambush. The GPS coordinates for the downed helicopter placed it in the center of this geological nightmare, surrounded by elevated positions that would give enemy fighters commanding fields of fire. Sarah dropped her 10 to 300 feet above ground level, low enough to see individual rocks and tire tracks, but high enough to avoid the worst of the small arms fire she knew was coming. At this altitude, the desert rushed past her canopy in a blur of browns and tans, broken occasionally by the geometric patterns of abandoned buildings or the dark scars where IEDs had torn chunks from the earth. Reaper 1-1, this is Viper 1-1. Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. I have you in sight. Be advised, I'm picking up multiple heat signatures in your target area. Looks like they've got vehicles moving to surround the crash site. Sarah keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through her system. Roger, Viper. Any word from the downed crew? Negative. CSAR frequencies have been silent for the last 23 minutes. Combat search and rescue going silent could mean many things, none of them good. The helicopter crew might be unconscious, captured, or worse. But it could also mean they were smart enough to maintain radio silence to avoid giving away their position to enemy fighters monitoring American frequencies. The first sign of trouble appeared as a thin line of black smoke rising from behind a low ridge approximately 2 kilometers ahead. Sarah adjusted her heading slightly, following the smoke like a deadly beacon. As she crested the ridge, the full scope of the disaster revealed itself in stark, terrible detail. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter lay twisted in the bottom of a wadi, its main rotor blades scattered like broken toys across 50 meters of sand. The aircraft had obviously auto-rotated in after taking catastrophic damage, but the pilots had managed to avoid a complete crash. The fuselage remained largely intact, which meant there was still hope that the crew had survived the impact. But surrounding the crash site like wolves circling wounded prey, Sarah counted at least 30 enemy fighters moving through the rocks and scrub brush. They had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the helicopter, advancing slowly and methodically toward their trapped quarry. 2 technical vehicles, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, were positioned on elevated ground overlooking the crash site, ready to pour devastating fire into anyone who tried to approach the helicopter. Sarah's tactical mind processed the situation in seconds. The enemy had turned the crash site into a perfect killing ground, using the helicopter as bait to draw in rescue forces. Anyone approaching the wadi would be caught in a crossfire from multiple directions, with no cover and no escape routes. It was a textbook ambush, professionally planned and expertly executed. Viper 1-1, this is Reaper 1-1. I have eyes on the crash site. Count approximately 30 dismounted enemy infantry and 2 technicals with crew serve weapons. The helicopter appears intact, but I don't see any movement from the crew. Copy, Reaper. How do you want to play this? Sarah banked her 10 into a wide circle around the crash site, studying the terrain and enemy positions with the cold calculation of a chess master planning her next move. The textbook approach would be to call in additional air support, wait for a proper search and rescue package with helicopters and ground forces, and assault the position with overwhelming firepower. But textbook approaches took time, and time was something the down crew didn't have. I'm going to hit the technicals first, Sarah announced, her decision made with characteristic decisiveness. Once I take out their heavy weapons, I'll work the infantry positions from east to west. You stay high and watch for anyone trying to flee the area. Reaper, that's a lot of ground to cover for one aircraft. You sure you don't want to wait for backup? The question hung in the air for a moment while Sarah considered her options. She could wait for reinforcements, follow proper procedures, and assault the position with a full package of aircraft and supporting fires. But every minute they waited was another minute for the enemy to execute the helicopter crew or for additional hostile forces to arrive and turn a difficult situation into an impossible one. Negative, Viper. Those are our people down there, and they've been alone too long already. Sarah rolled her A-10 into a steep dive, the distinctive whine of her engines changing pitch as she lined up on the first technical vehicle. At 500 feet above ground level, she could see the enemy fighters clearly, men in a mixture of military uniforms and civilian clothes, armed with AK-47 rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. They were professional fighters, not the poorly equipped militia she had encountered in previous missions. The enemy had obviously heard her engines, because muzzle flashes began to sparkle from positions throughout the wadi as small arms fire reached up toward her aircraft. Sarah ignored the incoming rounds, focusing entirely on the heavy machine gun that represented the greatest threat to any rescue operation. At 300 meters range, she squeezed the trigger on her Gu-8 cannon. The 30mm Gatling gun erupted in a sound like the world's largest zipper being torn open at supersonic speed. Depleted uranium rounds, each the size of a milk bottle, streamed from the 7-barrel cannon at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The first burst lasted exactly 1.2 seconds, expending 47 rounds that turned the first technical vehicle into a cloud of vaporized metal and superheated gas. The effect on enemy morale was immediate and dramatic. The coordinated advance toward the helicopter stopped as fighters dove for cover, abandoning their careful approach in favor of individual survival. But Sarah wasn't finished. Rolling out of her first attack run, she immediately banked left and lined up on the second technical vehicle, which had begun moving erratically as its driver tried to find cover behind a cluster of large rocks. The A-10's low speed and incredible maneuverability allowed Sarah to track the moving target with ease, adjusting her flight path to maintain the perfect firing solution. The second burst from her cannon lasted only 0.8 of a second, but it was enough to reduce the pickup truck and its heavy machine gun to a smoking crater. 2 threats eliminated in less than 30 seconds of combat. But eliminating the technicals had only solved part of the problem. Nearly 30 enemy fighters remained in positions around the crash site, and they were beginning to recover from the initial shock of her attack. RPG rounds began to streak through the air around her A-10, leaving trails of white smoke as they passed dangerously close to her aircraft. Sarah pulled up sharply, gaining altitude to avoid the growing volume of ground fire while she planned her next approach. From 1,000 feet, she could see the entire battlefield laid out below her like a 3-dimensional map. The enemy fighters had taken cover in rocky outcroppings and small buildings scattered throughout the wadi, positions that would be difficult to hit with conventional bombs, but perfect targets for her cannon. Reaper, this is Viper. Morrison's voice cut through the radio static. You've got more company incoming from the northwest. Count 4 vehicles approaching your position at high speed. Sarah looked in the direction Morrison had indicated and saw 4 dust plumes rising from the desert floor, each marking a vehicle racing toward the crash site. The enemy reinforcements would arrive in approximately 5 minutes, turning her already difficult mission into something approaching suicide. But As she began her second attack run, Sarah spotted something that changed everything. Movement near the helicopter, subtle, almost invisible, but definitely human. The crew was alive, and they were trying to signal her. Using a small mirror or piece of reflective metal, someone inside or near the helicopter was flashing a pattern toward her aircraft. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 3 long. The international SOS signal. The downed airmen were conscious, coherent, and desperate for rescue. The knowledge that Americans were alive and counting on her galvanized Sarah's resolve. She rolled inverted and pulled her nose toward the ground, beginning a diving attack that would take her directly through the heart of the enemy positions. At this angle and speed, she would be vulnerable to ground fire for the entire length of her attack run, but she would also be able to engage multiple targets in a single pass. The earth rushed up toward her canopy as she dove toward the enemy positions. Muzzle flashes erupted from at least a dozen locations as automatic weapons fire reached up toward her aircraft like deadly fireflies. Something struck her left wing with a metallic ping that she felt through the aircraft structure, but the A-10's legendary durability absorbed the impact without affecting her flight controls. At 200 meters range, Sarah opened fire with her cannon, walking the deadly stream of depleted uranium rounds across a line of enemy positions carved into the rocky walls of the wadi. The 30mm ammunition chewed through stone and steel alike, collapsing fighting positions and sending enemy fighters scrambling for new cover. She held the trigger down for a full 2 seconds, expending nearly 130 rounds in a devastating display of precision firepower. When she released the trigger and pulled up from her dive, at least 8 enemy positions had been neutralized, their occupants either killed or forced to abandon their weapons and flee. But the enemy wasn't finished. As Sarah climbed back to altitude, she saw muzzle flashes from new positions as the surviving fighters regrouped and prepared to continue their attack on the helicopter crew. The reinforcements Morrison had spotted were now visible as individual vehicles, each carrying additional fighters and weapons. "Reaper, those vehicles will be in range in 3 minutes," Morrison warned. "You need to break off, and let me take them with Mavericks." Sarah considered the suggestion for approximately half a second before rejecting it. Morrison's F16 carried AGM-65 Maverick missiles that could destroy the approaching vehicles, but launching them would require him to descend to lower altitude, where he would be vulnerable to the same ground fire that was now reaching toward her A-10. More importantly, engaging the reinforcements would mean temporarily abandoning the helicopter crew to the surviving fighters already at the crash site. Negative Viper. Stay high and maintain overwatch. I'm going back in. Reaper, you're taking too much fire down there. Your aircraft can't take many more hits. Sarah glanced at her instrument panel, noting the yellow caution lights that indicated minor damage to her left engine and hydraulic system. The A-10 had been designed to absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft, but even the mighty Warthog had its limits. But as she banked around for another attack run, the sun reflected off something near the helicopter that made her breath catch in her throat. A figure in a flight suit was moving near the aircraft's tail section, dragging what appeared to be another crew member toward better cover. The helicopter crew wasn't just alive, they were mobile and fighting for their lives. The sight of Americans refusing to give up, even when surrounded and outgunned by overwhelming odds, triggered something primal in Sarah's warrior soul. These were her people, her fellow airmen, and they were counting on her to give them a fighting chance. Rolling into her steepest dive yet, Sarah committed herself and her aircraft to a level of combat that pushed both pilot and machine beyond their design limits. The approaching reinforcements, the increasing volume of ground fire, the growing list of caution lights on her instrument panel, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was bringing Americans home. The third attack run nearly killed her. Sarah dove her A-10 into the teeth of a ground firestorm that would have shredded any other aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Tracer rounds streaked past her canopy like angry hornets, while RPG rounds exploded close enough to rock her aircraft with their blast waves. But the titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit held firm, and Her twin engines continued to provide the power she needed to maintain her impossible mission. This time, she approached from the west, using the sun at her back to blind enemy gunners and complicate their aim. The four-vehicle convoy of reinforcements had closed to within 1 kilometer of the crash site, and she could see armed fighters dismounting from their trucks and moving to establish new firing positions. In less than 2 minutes, the enemy force would double in size, making rescue impossible. But first, she had to deal with the immediate threat to the helicopter crew. During her previous attack runs, Sarah had noticed that the enemy fighters were using a series of interconnected caves and tunnel systems carved into the wadi walls. The natural formations provided excellent protection from air attack and allowed the fighters to move between positions without exposing themselves to her cannon fire. It was a sophisticated defensive setup that spoke to careful planning and professional military training. But every defensive position had weaknesses, and Sarah had spotted this one during her second attack run. The tunnel system had only 2 entrances, both located on the eastern wall of the wadi. If she could collapse those entrances with precision strikes, she would trap a significant number of enemy fighters underground, while simultaneously cutting off their ability to reinforce positions closer to the helicopter. Rolling inverted, Sarah pulled her nose down until the earth filled her entire windscreen. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock as she dove toward the first tunnel entrance, ignoring the increasing volume of ground fire that was now reaching toward her from multiple directions. Something struck her right wing with enough force to activate a master caution alarm, but she continued her dive without deviation. At 150 meters range, she fired a single AGM-65 Maverick missile. The missile streaked away from her aircraft like a bolt of lightning, its infrared seeker head locked onto the heat signature of the tunnel entrance. Sarah pulled up hard from her dive, feeling G-forces press her deep into her ejection seat as she climbed away from the impact point. The explosion lit up the wadi like a miniature sun. The Maverick's 125-pound warhead, designed to penetrate tank armor, vaporized the rocky overhang above the tunnel entrance and brought down several tons of stone and debris. The tunnel mouth disappeared in a cloud of dust and pulverized rock, sealing at least 8 enemy fighters inside their underground fortress. Before the dust had time to settle, Sarah was already lining up on the second tunnel entrance. But this time, the enemy was ready for her. The remaining fighters had coordinated their fire, creating an interlocking pattern of automatic weapons fire that filled the airspace above the crash site with deadly metal. Sarah flew directly into this storm of lead and steel, her aircraft shuddering under multiple impacts as small arms rounds found their mark. The master caution alarm began to sound continuously, indicating damage to multiple aircraft systems. Her left engine began to run rough, its exhaust temperature climbing toward dangerous levels. Hydraulic pressure in her primary flight control system dropped to minimal levels, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. But she held her dive. At 120 meters range, she fired her second Maverick missile. The weapon impacted the tunnel entrance with devastating precision, collapsing the opening and trapping the remaining fighters in their underground positions. In less than 3 minutes of combat, Sarah had effectively neutralized more than half of the enemy force through a combination of direct fire and tactical ingenuity. But the approaching reinforcements were now less than 500 meters from the crash site, close enough that Sarah could see individual fighters jumping from their vehicles and spreading out to establish new firing positions. She was running out of time, ammunition, and aircraft. Reaper 1-1, this is Viper 1-1. Morrison's voice cut through the chaos of combat. Your left engine is streaming smoke, and I can see holes in your wing from up here. You need to break off and return to base immediately. Sarah glanced at her engine instruments and felt her heart sink. Her left engine was indeed in serious trouble, with exhaust gas temperatures approaching redline and oil pressure dropping steadily. In any normal situation, she would declare an emergency and return to base immediately before the engine seized completely. But the situation was far from normal. Below her, she could see 2 figures in flight suits moving between the rocks near the helicopter wreckage. The downed aircrew was still alive, still fighting, still counting on her to provide them with the covering fire they needed to survive. Abandoning them now would mean condemning them to death or capture. Negative, Viper. I still have one good engine and plenty of ammunition. I'm staying until the job is done. Reaper, that's not advisable. My aircraft will hold together long enough to get these people home. The confidence in Sarah's voice was absolute, born from an intimate understanding of her machine's capabilities and limitations. The A-10 had been designed to operate in exactly these conditions, damaged under fire with multiple system failures. She had trained for this scenario hundreds of times in simulators and practice ranges. Now it was time to prove that the training worked. But as she banked around for what might be her final attack run, Sarah faced a tactical problem that no amount of training had prepared her for. The enemy reinforcements had spread out across nearly 2 kilometers of desert, making it impossible to engage them all before they reached firing positions that would threaten the helicopter crew. She needed to find a way to delay or divert their advance while simultaneously protecting the downed airmen. The solution came to her with the clarity of divine inspiration. Instead of attacking the reinforcements directly, Sarah decided to attack their transportation. The 4 vehicles they had arrived and were parked in a loose cluster approximately 800 meters from the crash site, unguarded because their occupants were focused on advancing toward the helicopter. If she could destroy those vehicles, she would strand the reinforcements in the desert and force them to either retreat on foot or continue their advance without the mobility and heavy weapons the trucks provided. Rolling into a diving attack that took her directly over the advancing enemy fighters, Sarah ignored their desperate attempts to bring her down with small arms fire. The A-10 absorbed multiple hits to its fuselage and wings, but the critical systems remained operational. Her right engine continued to provide full power, and her flight controls responded normally despite the loss of hydraulic pressure. At 200 meters range, she opened fire with her cannon on the parked vehicles. The Gu-8's 30mm rounds tore through the unarmored trucks like tissue paper, igniting fuel tanks and ammunition stores in a series of spectacular explosions. Within seconds, all 4 vehicles were burning wrecks, their destruction sending a column of black smoke high into the desert sky. The psychological effect on the enemy reinforcements was immediate and dramatic. Seeing their transportation and heavy weapons destroyed by a single aircraft, the advancing fighters began to falter in their attack. Some took cover and continued advancing, but others began to withdraw toward the relative safety of distant hills. But Sarah wasn't finished. Banking sharply to the left, she lined up on the largest concentration of enemy fighters still advancing toward the helicopter. These men were professionals, disciplined enough to continue their mission despite the destruction of their vehicles and the obvious danger posed by her continued presence overhead. At 250 meters range, she fired her final Maverick missile into the center of their formation. The explosion scattered the advancing fighters like leaves in a hurricane. The blast killed at least 3 men instantly and wounded several others, but more importantly, it broke the momentum of their coordinated advance toward the crash site. For the first time since the battle began, the immediate area around the helicopter was clear of enemy threats. Reaper 1-1, this is Dustoff 7-7. A new voice crackled through Sarah's radio. We're a flight of 2 medevac birds inbound to your location. What's the status of the LZ? Sarah felt a surge of relief, so intense it was almost overwhelming. The arrival of medical evacuation helicopters meant that the rescue she had been fighting to make possible was finally at hand. But the landing zone was still far from secure. Dustoff 7-7, this is Reaper 1-1. The immediate LZ is clear, but you have scattered enemy infantry in the surrounding area. I can provide close air support during your extraction, but my aircraft has taken damage and my fuel is getting low. Roger, Reaper. We have you in sight. Your aircraft is definitely showing battle damage, but you're still flying. We'll be on the ground for approximately 90 seconds. Can you keep the bad guys off us for that long? Sarah glanced at her fuel gauge and engine instruments. Her left engine had finally seized completely, its warning lights glowing red across her instrument panel. Her right engine was running normally, but Her fuel was down to less than 15 minutes of flight time. She had perhaps 3 or 4 more firing passes with her cannon before she would be forced to return to base. Roger, dust off. I can give you 90 seconds, but after that you're on your own. Understood, Reaper. We're beginning our approach now. And Reaper? Go ahead, dust off. Whatever you've been doing down there, it worked. We can see the down crew moving around near their aircraft. They're alive and mobile. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After more than an hour of uncertainty, she finally had confirmation that her desperate mission had succeeded. The helicopter crew was alive, mobile, and about to be rescued. Everything she had risked, every damage her aircraft had sustained, every moment of terror as enemy fire reached up toward her cockpit, it had all been worthwhile. But the mission wasn't over yet. The medevac helicopters were still vulnerable during their landing and takeoff, and scattered enemy fighters remained in the area. For the next 90 seconds, Sarah would have to provide the most precise and effective close air support of her career while flying a badly damaged aircraft with virtually no fuel reserves. As the first medevac helicopter began its descent toward the crash site, Sarah spotted movement in the rocks approximately 400 meters to the southeast. 3 enemy fighters with an RPG launcher were moving into position to engage the landing helicopter. Rolling into her final attack run, Sarah committed the last of her ammunition and the remaining operational life of her aircraft to ensuring that 4 American airmen would live to see another day. The final attack run was pure poetry written in depleted uranium and determination. Sarah dove her crippled A-10 toward the 3 enemy fighters who were preparing to fire their RPG at the incoming medevac helicopter. With only 1 engine and rapidly diminishing fuel, she had perhaps 30 seconds of combat time remaining before she would be forced to break off and attempt a return to base. But 30 seconds was enough. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves in a natural depression between 2 large boulders, creating an excellent firing position that would be nearly impossible to spot from ground level. But from Sarah's aerial vantage point, they stood out like wolves stalking sheep. She could see the distinctive shape of an RPG-7 launcher and the backblast signature that would give away their position the moment they fired. At 300 meters range, Sarah squeezed her cannon trigger for what she knew would be the last time. The GU-8 Gatling gun roared to life one final time, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the rocky depression with surgical precision. The depleted uranium ammunition struck the stone around the enemy position like the hammer of an angry god, sending up a cloud of pulverized rock and superheated metal fragments. When the dust cleared 3 seconds later, the RPG team had simply ceased to exist. Target neutralized, Sarah announced over the radio, her voice calm despite the fact that her aircraft was now operating on fumes and a prayer. Dust off, your LZ is clear. Get them out of there. Below her, the first medevac helicopter touched down in a cloud of rotor wash and desert dust. She watched with professional satisfaction as 4 figures ran from the crash helicopter toward the waiting aircraft, 3 crew members supporting a 4th who appeared to be wounded but mobile. The entire pickup took exactly 47 seconds, a testament to the professionalism of the medical evacuation crews who risked their lives daily to save others. As the medevac helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo, Sarah felt a mixture of triumph and growing concern. Her fuel gauge was now reading dangerously low, and her remaining engine was beginning to show signs of stress from operating alone. The 60-kilometer flight back to base would push her aircraft to its absolute limits. Reaper 1-1, this is Dustoff 7-7, the medevac pilot radioed. We have all 4 crew members aboard. 3 are in good condition. 1 has a broken leg and some burns, but everyone's going to make it home. I don't know how you did it, but you just pulled off the impossible. Sarah smiled for the first time since the mission began, feeling the weight of success wash over her like warm sunlight. 4 American airmen were alive and safe because she had been willing to push her aircraft and herself beyond any reasonable limit. It was exactly the kind of mission that justified every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of terror that combat aviation demanded. Roger, dust off. Glad I could help. Now get them to medical attention. But As Sarah began her climb to a safe altitude for the return flight to base, her remaining engine began to run rough. The exhaust gas temperature climbed steadily toward redline, while oil pressure dropped in a pattern that suggested imminent mechanical failure. She had pushed the General Electric TF-34 turbofan far beyond its design limitations, and it was finally beginning to surrender to the abuse. Viper 1-1. This is Reaper 1-1, Sarah called to Morrison, who had been maintaining his protective orbit overhead throughout the entire engagement. I'm showing signs of engine failure on my remaining power plant. I may need you to escort me home. Morrison's F-16 dropped from altitude and slid into formation beside Sarah's battle-damaged A-10. The fighter pilots practiced, immediately assessing the extent of the damage. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sarah's aircraft looked like it had been used for target practice by an entire infantry battalion. Her left wing showed at least 20 bullet holes, some large enough to put a fist through. Her left engine was completely dead, its intake partially collapsed and trailing wisps of smoke. Her right wing displayed evidence of at least 3 RPG near misses, with scorched metal and twisted control surfaces that should have made the aircraft unflyable. But somehow, impossibly, the A-10 was still in the air and still under control. Jesus Christ, Reaper, Morrison breathed over the radio. How is that thing still flying? Superior engineering and stubborn pilot, Sarah replied, though she could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control as hydraulic fluid leaked from damaged lines and flight control systems began to fail. Think you can keep me company on the way home? Copy that. I'll stick with you all the way to the pattern. The flight back to base became an exercise in applied aerodynamics and pure willpower. Sarah's remaining engine continued to deteriorate, forcing her to constantly adjust power settings and flight attitudes to maintain level flight. Her hydraulic systems had failed completely, requiring her to use manual reversion controls that made the aircraft handle like a freight train with square wheels. But the A-10 kept flying. 15 kilometers from base, her engine finally gave up completely. The sudden loss of power was accompanied by a tremendous bang and a shower of sparks from her right engine exhaust. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree as the turbofan wound down to silence, leaving Sarah flying a powered glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. Mayday, 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 Sarah transmitted over the emergency frequency. Reaper 1-1 has lost all engine power 15 kilometers southeast of Spiker. I am attempting a dead-stick approach to runway 27. The response from the air traffic control tower was immediate and professional. Reaper 1-1, this is Spiker Tower. We copy your mayday call. Runway 27 is clear and emergency equipment is standing by. Winds are calm, visibility unlimited. You are cleared for immediate emergency approach. But even as the tower cleared her for landing, Sarah knew she was facing the most difficult flying challenge of her career. A dead-stick approach in an A-10 was possible, but it required perfect energy management and more than a little luck. She would have exactly one chance to get it right because there would be no opportunity for a go-around. Viper 1-1, this is Reaper 1-1, Sarah called to Morrison. I'm going to need you to call out my altitude and airspeed during the approach. My instruments are getting unreliable. Roger, Reaper. I'm right here with you. Current altitude is 8,000 feet, airspeed 180 knots. You're looking good for a straight-in approach. Sarah began a careful descent toward the runway, using every technique she had ever learned from maximizing her aircraft's gliding performance. She lowered her landing gear and flaps at precisely the right moment to minimize drag while providing the maximum amount of lift. She adjusted her flight path to compensate for the crosswind that had developed since her departure hours earlier. Most importantly, she flew with the absolute precision that comes only from years of experience and the knowledge that failure would mean death. At 3,000 feet, she could see the runway clearly, a welcome strip of asphalt that represented safety and survival. Emergency vehicles were already positioned along the runway edges, their red and blue lights flashing in the desert sun. Firefighters and medical personnel stood ready to respond to whatever condition her aircraft might be in when it finally stopped rolling. Altitude 2,000 feet, airspeed 140 knots, Morrison called. You're on glide path, looking good. Sarah made a minor adjustment to her flight controls, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly to her inputs. The A-10 was barely flying now, held aloft more by momentum and favorable aerodynamics than by any remaining lift from its wings. But it was still flying, and that was all that mattered. Altitude 1,000 feet, airspeed 120 knots, Morrison continued. You're slightly low on glide path, but still within parameters. Sarah eased back on her stick slightly, trading some of her precious airspeed for altitude. The aircraft responded reluctantly, warning her that she was approaching the edge of its flight envelope. But she needed every foot of altitude she could get to ensure she cleared the runway threshold. At 500 feet, she could see individual faces among the emergency crews waiting beside the runway. These were her friends and colleagues, people who had worked beside her and worried about her during every mission she had flown. Their presence gave her the final measure of determination she needed to complete what had become the most difficult landing of her career. Altitude 300 feet, airspeed 100 knots, Morrison announced. You're on glide path and looking perfect. Just hold what you've got. The runway threshold passed beneath her aircraft at exactly the right altitude and airspeed. Sarah held her approach angle constant, resisting the temptation to pull back on the stick and flare too early. The A-10 settled toward the asphalt with the inevitability of gravity, its landing gear extending toward the runway like the talons of a wounded eagle finally coming home to roost. The main landing gear touched down with a solid thump that Sarah felt through her entire body. The aircraft bounced once, settled back onto the runway, and began to roll out normally. She applied her wheel brakes carefully, mindful that her hydraulic systems had failed and that she was operating on backup pneumatic pressure alone. But the A-10 rolled to a stop exactly where it was supposed to, in the center of the runway, with emergency equipment positioned on both sides. As Sarah shut down her aircraft systems and prepared to egress from the cockpit, she realized that she had just completed one of the most successful missions in the history of close air support aviation. 4 American airmen were alive because she had been willing to risk everything to save them. Her aircraft had absorbed more battle damage than any A-10 in recent memory and had still brought her home safely. But as the adrenaline began to fade and the full scope of what she had accomplished began to sink in, Sarah also realized that her war was far from over. There would be other missions, other Americans in danger, other impossible rescues that would demand everything she had to give. And she would be ready for all of them. The emergency crews reached her aircraft within seconds of its complete stop, their faces showing a mixture of relief and professional concern. As Sarah climbed down from her cockpit and stepped onto the solid ground of the runway, she was surprised to see Colonel Davidson himself among the crowd of people waiting to greet her. "Outstanding work, Captain," the colonel said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that could only be earned through demonstrated courage under fire. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen." Sarah nodded, accepting the praise, but already thinking ahead to the inevitable debrief and the paperwork that would follow. More importantly, she was thinking about the 4 airmen who were probably arriving at the base medical facility at that very moment, alive and safe because an A-10 pilot had refused to abandon them. That, ultimately, was what made everything else worthwhile. 3 hours after Sarah's miraculous landing, every pilot on forward operating base Spiker had gathered around her damaged tin like pilgrims visiting a shrine. The aircraft sat in the maintenance hangar, surrounded by red tags and technical inspectors, looking more like a piece of abstract art than a flying machine. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez moved through the crowd with the reverence of a man examining a religious relic. In his 15 years of maintaining military aircraft, he had never seen anything like the damage Sarah's A-10 had absorbed and survived. The left wing alone showed 43 separate impact points from small arms fire. The fuselage displayed evidence of at least 6 near misses from RPG rounds. The left engine had been completely destroyed by what appeared to be a direct hit from heavy machine gun fire. But somehow, impossibly, the aircraft had continued to fly for more than an hour of combat, and had brought its pilot home safely. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, approaching Sarah with a clipboard full of damage assessment reports. "I've been working on A-10s since before you were born, and I can honestly say I've never seen anything like this. By every rule in the book, this aircraft should have fallen out of the sky 30 minutes into your mission." Sarah studied the damage reports, noting the extent of the destruction her aircraft had sustained. The total number of combat hits exceeded anything in the historical record for a single A-10 mission. Yet every critical system had continued to function long enough to complete the rescue and return to base. "She's a tough old bird," Sarah replied, running her hand along a section of the titanium armor that surrounded the cockpit. "Built by people who understood that sometimes you have to fly through hell to bring Americans home." But as Sarah examined her aircraft, she began to notice something that made her blood run cold. Several of the impact points showed evidence of armor-piercing ammunition, rounds specifically designed to defeat the A-10's titanium protection. The enemy fighters she had engaged weren't the typical insurgents armed with surplus Soviet weapons. They had been equipped with sophisticated military hardware that suggested professional training and state-level support. Colonel Davidson appeared beside her, his expression grim as he studied the same evidence that had caught Sarah's attention. "Captain, we need to talk." Privately, they walked to a quiet corner of the hangar, away from the crowd of pilots and maintenance personnel who were still marveling at the damaged aircraft. Davidson's expression carried the weight of someone who had received intelligence briefings that painted a disturbing picture. "Sarah, the 4 airmen you rescued have been debriefed by intelligence officers," Davidson began, his voice carefully controlled. "What they told us changes everything we thought we knew about your mission." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. "What did they find, sir?" The helicopter crew was deliberately targeted for capture, not destruction. The enemy fighters who shot them down were specifically tasked with taking American aircrews alive for propaganda purposes. They had been planning this operation for weeks, using detailed intelligence about our flight patterns and rescue procedures. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The mission that had seemed like a routine combat search and rescue operation had actually been a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to capture American airmen for use in terrorist propaganda videos. The professional competence of the enemy fighters, their sophisticated weapons, and their tactical patience all made sense in this new context. "But, sir," Sarah said, struggling to process the information, "if they wanted to capture the crew alive, why did they fight so hard when I arrived to provide air support?" Davidson's expression darkened further. "Because you weren't supposed to be able to provide effective air support. According to the intelligence we've gathered, they expected us to respond with F-16s flying at high altitude, fast movers making one pass and leaving the area. They were prepared for that kind of response." Sarah felt the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. They weren't prepared for an A-10. Exactly. Your persistence, your ability to stay over the target area, and provide continuous fire support completely disrupted their plan. Instead of capturing 4 American airmen for propaganda purposes, they ended up in a running gun battle with a pilot who refused to follow their script. The knowledge that she had unknowingly foiled a major terrorist operation should have filled Sarah with pride. Instead, she felt a growing sense of unease as the full implications of Davidson's briefing began to sink in. "Sir, what does this mean for future operations?" Davidson was quiet for a long moment, studying the damaged aircraft that represented both a tremendous victory and a dangerous revelation. "It means that our enemies have learned to plan specifically around our tactics and capabilities. It means that the element of surprise that has protected our people for the past 2 years has been compromised." Sarah followed his gaze to her battle-scarred A-10, suddenly understanding why the aircraft had been red-tagged and removed from flight status. It wasn't just about the extensive battle damage or the need for major repairs. The aircraft had become a symbol of something that made the command structure deeply uncomfortable. "They're ground in the A-10 fleet, aren't they?" Davidson nodded reluctantly. "Temporarily, until we can develop new tactics and procedures that account for enemy countermeasures." The Pentagon believes that low-altitude, close air support has become too dangerous for single aircraft operations. Sarah felt something die inside her chest. The A-10 wasn't just an aircraft to her. It was the perfect tool for the mission she had dedicated her life to accomplishing. The idea of American servicemen bleeding on the ground while air support remained at safe distances, dropping bombs from high altitude, and hoping for the best, was anathema to everything she believed about military aviation. Sir, with respect, that's exactly the wrong lesson to learn from this mission. Yes, the enemy was prepared for our standard response, but they weren't prepared for a pilot willing to stay and fight. They weren't prepared for someone who refused to abandon Americans in trouble. I understand your perspective, Captain, but the decision has been made at levels far above my authority. The A-10 fleet will be temporarily grounded while new tactics are developed. As they talked, Sarah noticed that a crowd had gathered around them. F-16 pilots, helicopter crews, maintenance personnel, and ground troops, representatives from every unit on the base. They had obviously overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. Captain Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his expression reflecting the confusion and anger that Sarah saw in every face around her. "Colonel, are you seriously telling us that Captain Shun is being punished for saving 4 American lives?" "This isn't about punishment," Davidson replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "This is about adapting our tactics to account for changing enemy capabilities." "Bullshit, sir." The voice came from Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, whose normally respectful demeanor had given way to something approaching rage. "This is about bureaucrats in Washington being afraid of pilots who actually know how to fight." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah could see the same sentiment reflected in every face, the recognition that something fundamentally wrong was happening, that courage was being punished while cowardice was being institutionalized as policy. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Martinez, one of the helicopter crew members Sarah had rescued earlier that day, pushed through the crowd until she stood directly in front of Colonel Davidson. Her flight suit was still stained with blood and desert dust, and her left arm was in a sling from injuries sustained during the crash. "Sir," Martinez said, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had looked death in the face and been saved by another person's courage. "Captain Chen risked everything to save my crew. She flew a damaged aircraft through enemy fire for over an hour because she refused to let Americans die on her watch. And now you're telling us that kind of courage is no longer acceptable?" Davidson looked uncomfortable under the combined scrutiny of the assembled crowd. "Sergeant, I understand your gratitude, but no, sir, I don't think you do understand." Martinez's voice cut through his attempted explanation like a blade. "What I understand is that there are politicians and bureaucrats who have never been shot at making decisions about how to fight a war they'll never have to participate in." The crowd's murmur of agreement grew louder, and Sarah realized that something significant was happening. These weren't just individual expressions of disagreement with a policy decision. This was a collective rejection of a command philosophy that prioritized bureaucratic convenience over the lives of American servicemen. Morrison stepped up beside Martinez, his voice carrying the weight of someone speaking for the entire fighter pilot community. "Colonel, every pilot on this base has been saved at least once by 10 drivers willing to risk everything for close air support. You ground the Warthogs, and you're going to get a lot of good people killed." Rodriguez moved to join them, representing the maintenance crews who kept the aircraft flying. "Sir, I've spent my entire career working on machines designed to bring Americans home. That A-10 right there is shot to hell, but it did exactly what it was designed to do. It brought Captain Chen home, and it brought 4 other Americans home with her." One by one, other personnel stepped forward to stand with the small group that was forming around Sarah and her damaged aircraft. Helicopter pilots who had depended on A-10 close air support during countless missions. Ground troops who had been saved by the distinctive sound of Gu-8 cannon fire when their situations looked hopeless. Intelligence analysts who had seen the tactical intelligence that proved the effectiveness of persistent close air support. Within minutes, nearly every operational person on the base had gathered around tail number 78-0691, creating a silent but powerful demonstration of support for both Sarah and the aircraft that had carried her through an impossible mission. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her and felt a mixture of pride and profound sadness. These were the people who actually fought America's wars, who risked their lives daily to protect their fellow servicemen and accomplish missions that bureaucrats thousands of miles away would never understand. And they were being told that their judgment, their experience, and their sacrifice were less important than the comfort of politicians who would never face enemy fire. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice carrying to every person in the hangar. "All of you. But this isn't about me, and it isn't about my aircraft. This is about whether we're going to fight this war the right way or the easy way." She gestured toward her battle-damaged 10, its scarred fuselage bearing witness to the price of bringing Americans home. That aircraft took more punishment than any machine should be able to survive, but it kept flying because it was built by people who understood that sometimes you have to accept risk to accomplish the mission. If we start making decisions based on avoiding risk instead of accomplishing the mission, we're going to lose a lot more than airplanes. Colonel Davidson stood silently for a long moment, studying the faces of the people under his command. These were professionals who had volunteered to serve in one of the most dangerous theaters of operation in the world. They had earned the right to have their opinions heard and their experience respected. "Captain Shun," he said finally, his voice carrying a new tone of respect and determination, "I want you to write a detailed after-action report about today's mission. Include everything: tactics, equipment performance, enemy capabilities, and recommendations for future operations. I'll make sure it reaches the people who need to see it." Sarah nodded, understanding that Davidson was offering her the opportunity to make her case directly to the decision-makers. It might not change the immediate grounding order, but it would ensure that the lessons learned from her mission would be preserved and considered. But as the crowd began to disperse and people returned to their duties, Sarah remained beside her aircraft, studying the damage that told the story of 4 American lives saved and an enemy operation disrupted. She understood now why the F-16 pilots had gone silent when they recognized her tail number. It wasn't just about the aircraft or even about her personal reputation as a pilot. It was about the recognition that some missions require someone willing to fly through hell itself, regardless of the odds or the danger. And it was about the growing fear that such courage was becoming a liability rather than an asset in a military increasingly dominated by risk-averse bureaucrats. As the desert sun set behind the mountains, painting the hangar in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah made a silent promise to her damaged aircraft and to every American serviceman who might someday need the kind of help that only an A-10 pilot could provide. She would continue to fly through hell itself to bring Americans home, regardless of what the bureaucrats in Washington decided was acceptable risk, because some things were more important than career advancement or bureaucratic approval. Some things were worth dying for, and bringing Americans home was definitely one of them.